Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you a great method of painting Black Templar Crusaders for Warhammer 40,000 by Games Workshop, and to do so we're going to be using one of the new Primaris Crusader miniatures for our example, but it's worth noting that the Black Templars have a very similar colour scheme throughout their whole army, so the methods and techniques we're going to be using in this video can be used to paint a huge variety of troops, including things such as Sword Brethren, Neophytes and more. So we hope you enjoy it and we'll see you at the desk. To paint your Black Templars, the first thing that you need to do is to undercoat your miniatures, and in this case what I recommend you go for is a medium grey undercoat. So here I've used Mechanicus standard grey spray from Citadel. Now you might be wondering why I've gone for grey here, because Black Templars are mostly black, so there's a very good argument for going for a black undercoat. But the reason is because grey is a better starting point for all the other colours we're going to be using on the miniature, for things like the tabards, the weapons, all the metallics, everything like that. Now you could of course go for a black undercoat if you want to, and if you choose to do so it just takes a little bit longer with some of those other colours. So I find in the long run this saves a little bit of time, but the choice is entirely yours. Now whatever you do decide to do, the first thing that we need to do is to paint all of that power armor with black, and this is true even if you undercoat your miniature black. The reason is because the painted on version of black is going to have a different finish to what the undercoat's going to have, so later on when we're highlighting the power armor, should you need to neaten up any mistakes, you'll notice this difference, so it's important to do this now to avoid that happening. So all you need to do is to pick a black that you want to use, and in this case I'm going to go for Doom Death Black, which is one of our paints, but you can also go for Matte Black from the Army Painter or Abaddon Black from Citadel. The choice really is yours. Whatever you go for, as ever, make sure to give all your paints a good shake before you use each one, and all we need to do is to get some of this onto the palette. So there we go, got a little dollop there like that, and then let's pick a brush that you're comfortable with for the size that we're doing here. In this case I've got a monster brush from the Army Painter, so a nice large brush, and with this all I'm going to do is base coat all the power armor on the miniature. So as ever, we just need like a little bit of water there just to mix it in, to thin that paint down slightly, and then once that's done, all we've got to do is start applying this to the armour of the miniature. Now don't worry about being too neat at this stage, just concentrate on making sure you get all of that power armour, so the leg around here, but wherever possible, avoid catching it onto other details. So for example, the tabard. Doesn't matter if we happen to get a little bit there like that, because we can easily paint over that, but the less of that, the quicker it's going to be later on. Now if you can see some of that undercoat showing through, don't worry about it, just let the paint completely dry and apply a second thin coat in the exact same way. Once you have that even black on all the armour panels, the next thing to do is to mark in the white details that appear on the shoulder plates, so the main field of the design on there. And for this, what I recommend you go for is Corax White, and there's two main reasons for this. First of all, this paint's got very good coverage, so it's nice and easy to apply here, but also, it's not actually a pure white, it's a very, very, very light grey. Now the reason for this is, it'll look like it's white on its own, especially when put directly next to the black here, so don't worry about it not looking like white, it certainly will do. But it means that if you're painting a miniature in your Black Templars army that requires you to put highlights on those areas, so for example if you're doing the shoulder of Redemptor Dreadnought for example, it means that you can use a pure white to highlight this and get a nicer finish, whereas if you use a pure white here you'll have nowhere to go in that situation. So that's why I recommend you go for this colour. Now to apply it, go for a smaller brush now. I'm using a medium layer brush from Citadel for this, and all you got to do is, as ever, get some onto your palette and thin it down. Now this paint can be a little bit thick straight out the pot, so definitely make sure you shake it, you might need to stir it, but really what we're looking to do is to bring it down to a nice smooth consistency. So just test it on the palette until you bring it down to around about this kind of point here. So it's nice and smooth, it's flowing well from the brush, quite happy with that. And with this, what we need to do is to block in that main field on the shoulder plate. So for example, this one just here, looking to avoid the Templar symbol there. So we're looking at this sort of area, and you can see it's got nice coverage. And this is why I went for that grey undercoat, because it goes over really nicely here. Even though there's a few little splashes of black, it covers them really nicely in small situations like this. Now, if you do happen to catch that cross symbol, don't worry about it. Just neaten it with the black before you continue. But here, I do recommend, once again, you apply two thin coats. I've finished applying the Corax White to the shoulder plates, and you can see how next to that black, it does look like a pure white. So with that done, we can now move on to the next detail to base coat in, which is going to be the tabard. And for this, what we need is a sort of deep bone colour. So in this case, what I'm going to be using is one of ours. I've got here Dragon Fang, but the closest equivalent would be something like Zandri does from Citadel. So either of these paints is just fine here. And with this, all we're going to do is block this detail in, and some of it can be a little bit tricky to get to. So I recommend a medium-sized brush here, and I'm actually using a medium layer brush from Citadel. Now, as ever, we just need to make sure the paint's nicely thinned down. down, and then once you've got that ready, it's just a matter of loading up and blocking this detail in. And what we're looking at here is a tabard that comes down the middle. So we're looking at this area here, including the folded back part, but also the little bit of it that's visible just up here, just above the belt. With that tabard base coated, we can now move on to a few more base coats on the miniature before we apply our first wash onto it. And for this, what we need first is a warm brown for all the leather belts. So here I'm going to use some Fang brown. Then we need to base coat the red details in the miniature, such as the weapons. And here we need a deep red. So for this, I'm going to use some corn red. Finally, we can base coat the bronze details. And here I'm going to use some Spartan bronze, which again is one of ours. But you could also use some Balthasar gold from Citadel, which is a very close equivalent. But first of all, what we need is Fang brown for the base coat for all the leather. And here I'm again going to use that medium layer brush for the base coat here. All we're going to do is, as before, just get that paint nicely thin down the palette so it's under control, and make sure the brush isn't overloaded, because with this what we need to do is start moving around the miniature looking for these belts, and there tends to be quite a few around the waist. You can see them all the way around here. All you've got to do is just neatly start blocking them in, just being very careful, poking the paint in there, just avoid the tabard and also the black armour as you encounter it. Next up, we're ready for some red for the weapons, and in this case I've got corn red, and this is for the main casing of them, so for example down the side of the sword here and also the body of the pistol. Now in addition, keep an eye out for any Crusader seals on your Black Templar too, and if you've got any, for example I've got one down here in the leg, base coat in the parchment of these as well. And then finally, we're ready to base coat any details that you want to be bronze. In this case, I'm using Spartan bronze, which is one of ours, but a good equivalent would be Balthasar gold from Citadel. And for this, I've switched to a smaller brush. I'm actually using one of Citadel's small layer brushes for this, because some of these details can be quite intricate. So just take your time, being as neat as possible, picking these areas out. And with that bronze applied, we've now finished applying a number of base coats that can all share the same colour wash, which is going to be a dark brown wash. And the exception here is that black power armour, so don't worry about shading that. But everything else, what you need is just to choose a dark wash of your choice here. So in this case, I've gone for some Agrax Earthshade, and there's two different stages of applying this. First of all, what we want to do is focus on the white detail on those shoulder plates, because here we need to keep them as bright and clean as possible, and then everything else is going to use a slightly different technique. But to start out with that white, what you want to do is go for a finer brush, because here what we're going to be doing is applying this wash into the recesses. So recess shading essentially is what I'm doing here. So I've got a small layer brush from Citadel, and with this what I'm going to do is just use the palette just to control how much is on here, so there's not loads at once. Because with this what we need to do is use the fine tip of the brush to run it directly into the recessed corner. So for example, if we look at this shoulder plate just here, what we need to do is to paint it directly into this corner as neatly as possible. So just following that fine line down to get that little hint of brown in the recess of that detail to cleanly finish off that white where it meets the black. So again, the same just along here, as neatly as possible, run into that area there. Same around the chapter badge, so we're looking in the recess, just going around there like that. Now for the other colours, it's slightly different. In this case, what we want to do is apply it entirely over those areas. So to do this, go for a slightly larger brush now. In this case, it's a medium layer from Citadel. And with this, we want to paint it directly over these details, letting it settle as it will. So for example, if we take a look at the tabard, a fair amount loaded on there. We're looking at this kind of area around here. All we want to do is paint it directly over, just avoiding that black armour, but coating everything else, just letting it settle smoothly to get some nice shading on this detail. The wash is now completely dry, giving some nice definition on those details. And on the white, you can see it's not made it murky or anything, but it has, again, given that definition, especially around the outer edge. And with that done, we can now move on to the next set of base coats that are, again, all going to share the same wash. And in this case, it's going to be a black wash. And for here, first of all, we need to pick out all the joints in the armour. So for this, I'm going to use some Eshin grey. We want a kind of slightly dirty grey like that. But then after that, we need to base coat in all the silver details. And here I'm going to use some Surcoat Silver, which is one of the two thin coats paints. But any sort of deep silver like this will do. So something like Lead Belcher, for example, is a great choice. So what we need first of all though is Eshin grey, and to apply it I'm going to be using my small layer brush from Citadel, because these details can be quite small and tricky to get to. So for all of them, remember to make sure you use that palette to help control the paint, just making sure it's nicely thinned down with that little bit of water, and just checking to make sure your brush hasn't got too much on there. And with this, what we're looking for is the kind of soft parts of the joint. So on the back of the leg, as you can see, there's these sort of ridged areas just here. All we've got to do is block them in as neatly as possible, being careful of that black armour on either side. And then finally, we're ready to move on to base coating the silver details. And here I'm using Surcoat Silver, but as I mentioned, a great alternative would be Lead Belcher at this stage. And these details are all kinds of shapes and sizes. So for this, I recommend going for a smaller brush. Here I'm using a small airbrush to carefully pick out the chains. But all you've got to do is just work your way around the miniature, looking for any details like the chains, the mechanical parts and the weapons, for example, the back of the pistol just here, any vents, little details like that, and carefully block them out. With those colours blocked in, we're now ready to apply that black wash onto those too. And in this case, I'm going to be using some Norn oil. And to apply it, I'd recommend going for a small brush because it's very easy to lose control of this. And we only want to keep it on the joints of the armour that we just base coated and the silver as well. So to do this as well, I'd recommend that you use a palette to draw from to make sure that the brush isn't going to be overloaded. And once you've got that ready, it's just a matter of looking for these new areas and blocking it over. So anything that we painted with Eshin Grey earlier on, such as the joint around here, I'm just going to block all the way over that so it runs mostly into the recessed detail and gives it nice definition. But also we're looking for all the silver as well. So for example, the teeth and the chainsaw around here, just run it all the way over it so it settles nicely in the recesses. The black wash is now completely dry as well, and so we can now move on to the next phase of painting the miniature, which is going to be to do a little bit of layering to brighten some details up. And what I mean by layering is that essentially what we're going to do is revisit some of our original base coats, but this time applying the colour in a much more precise manner to avoid the recesses to retain the definition from the wash we had, whilst also brightening the area up. I'm going to start out by doing this on the red details, and so to do it we need to return to the original base coat colour, which was corn red in this case, and to apply it I'm now going to use a small airbrush from Citadel because I need that precision, you see, because what we're looking to do here is to paint it onto the flat of the panels that we've originally base coated red. So to help out with that, just make sure the paint's nicely thinned as ever, just bring it a little bit thinner than we had it for the base coat, so about this kind of consistency here. And just make sure you don't have loads on your brush, because as we're applying this, for example on the bolt pistol just here, what we're aiming for is these flat parts of the panels. So what we can do is very lightly start running across them like this, but only very gently, because as the brush reaches those recesses, it doesn't fall into the little vents just there. Same here where we've got this kind of grip. If we just very lightly skim across like this using the side of the brush, the colour only catches that raised area. And you can see it makes it cleaner and a little bit brighter too. We just need to be careful of things such as rivets, like we've got at the area under the gun just here, and just carefully manoeuvre around those, leaving it darker in the recessed parts. Now the same is true for all the red detail that we've got here, even on the chainsword. So for this, again, we just want to paint the flat side of it with this colour, so smoothly on this flat area just here. When you get to recesses such as this part here, you can see the black wash just around the little silver detail. What we want to do is not go quite into the corner, so about that kind of distance there to retain that definition. Now also we have that red parchment, and for this we want to be doing the same sort of thing, and you can see the texture is quite different on these areas. So instead, approach from the side, so you're kind of painting along those lines of the creases, and just run a few lines along it like this, just to emphasise that texture. With that layering done on the red now, you can see we've got a cleaner finish to those details, and so now what we need to do is move on to doing this on one other detail in the miniature, which is the tabard. But in this case, we're actually going to be doing it on a different texture, so it's fabric now. And in the case of this then, what we need to do is start to build it up a little bit more, add a bit more volume, and start to make it a little bit lighter. So first of all, we're going to return to that original colour we used here, which in this case is Dragon Fang. Now if you're stuck with Citadel here, what you'll need is some Zandri dust. But then after that, we need to take it a little bit lighter, so we're going to layer over the top of that using some Ashabti bone. But first of all we need Dragon Fang, and to apply it I'm sticking to that small layer brush, and I've still got some of my wet palette here which I'm going to use, just bringing it to a little open space just here to thin it down, because what we want to do is, like with that red, thin it down a little bit more than we had for the original base coat colour. So really kind of like this, a little bit translucent. This is the right sort of thinness that we need for it. And with this, what we need to do in the case of fabric is look carefully where the creases are and look to the recesses. So in the case here, you can see we've got this kind of part that's folded back and it's very dark in the deepest recess there. What we need to do is leave that really dark, skip past a little bit past it, so we've got the kind of shaded down version of this colour, and then go a little bit past that, so then we apply this fresh colour like this. So by doing this, you see what we do is create a gradient where the further into the recess we go, the darker it gets. And it's just a matter of doing that across all the fabric. And to do this, it really helps to paint the direction that the creases are going. So in this downward kind of sweeping motion like this. But wherever it gets a little bit darker, such as that very small part just there, just skip past it to leave that definition from the shading in that area. Same is true up here. You can see we get to these little creases just here. We want to stick to the raised up areas, leaving it darker in the recessed areas. And this way we're really building up the effect of that fabric moving down the front of the Marine just there. Once you're finished with that, you're then ready to move on to a shabty bone, and with this we're looking for a very similar technique, only more focused just at the very tops of the creases. So for example, just here we want to bring the colour down that area just there, a short distance down either side, but not all the way into the recess, still leaving some of that dragon fang showing. So by doing this, you see what we're doing is making it lighter towards the top and keeping all the definition from the shading and the deeper colours as well. And with that, the layering is now complete and we can move on to highlighting the miniature. And to do this, we're going to start out with the main part of the Black Templar, which is, of course, the black details of the power armour. And because this is such a main feature of the miniature, we're going to spend a bit of time here really building it up. Now, to do this, we're going to be doing some edge highlighting to get a nice sharp finish to it. And we're going to start out with a kind of bluish grey colour. And what this is going to do is lend a sort of subtle cleanness to the armour. So a very nice, neat appearance for them. And so the colour to use here is Dark Reaper. And to apply it, I'm going to be using my small airbrush from Citadel once again. And with this, for this first highlight, bear in mind it is just a first highlight. So what we want to do here is introduce it thinly towards the edge of each armor panel. And what we're going to do is build on top of this to make it look sharper after it. So this is going to be quite a broad edge highlight, but don't worry about it. We are going to focus it later on. Now the trick to doing this right is to make sure you get the paint thinned down to the correct amount. And often when people struggle with this kind of thing, it's because they're not having the ease of the paint properly flowing from the brush onto the miniature. So to get it right, just check what you're doing on the palette and just play around with the paint to bring it to about this kind of consistency. Now you can always test it on the palette by having a go at painting some fine lines with it using the tip of your brush. And if it flows quite well from the brush like it's doing here, that's okay, but you see it's starting to go a little bit too rough. So what I want to do is add just a touch more water to this to thin it down a tiny bit more. And then we'll try again. So once again, we're just going to have a go at painting some lines, and you can see now it's just generally running better from the brush and it's going on longer as well. So I'm much happier with that as a consistency for the paint. So with that prepared, we're ready then to start applying it to the miniature. And with this, wherever possible, look to angle the model so that you're actually approaching using the side of your brush. So for example, of this edge just here on the leg, what I'm doing is approaching at about 45 degrees from the flat and using the side close to the tip, I'm just going to skim along this edge fairly heavily to get a fairly broad edge highlight along the area there like that. And really it's as simple as that, going around all these edges wherever possible, using the side of your brush like this and following around those edges, just moving the model as you need to so that you're comfortable, so you can approach those parts and, well, get that highlight in those areas. And sometimes this does mean turning the model in some quite strange ways, for example like this, but you can see this way I can get to the edge fairly easily. Now sometimes you won't quite be able to do that using the side of your brush, in which case you need to use the tip of it, and when doing this I find a great way to get the hang of it, really to brace your hands as steady as possible on the table and approach the area that you're going to do, so this panel here, kind of getting it so it's vertically going down here, and painting this downward motion towards yourself because it's nice and easy to get that sweeping motion, so it's very easy to line up and just work that line across the area to get that highlight following that edge there like that. So now it's just a matter of going around all the edges and the black details of the marine doing this. And as you can tell, this is going to be one of the longest stages of painting the miniature, but definitely take your time here, because the neater you are at this stage, the better the marine is going to look once you're done. With that edge highlight applied, you can see it really helps to distinguish the shape of the black power armor and helps that detail stand out. And if you want to, you could just leave the black power armor there and it'll look great on the tabletop. But if you want to make it really pop, then what you need to do is a second edge highlight. And this is something you might just want to keep for your characters and squad leaders. It's really up to you how much of this you do. But if you do want to do it, what you now need is a lighter grey. So in this case, I've got some Dawnstone. And to apply it, you need as fine a brush as you've got. So in this case, I've got a detail brush here from the Army Painter, because what we're essentially looking to do is another edge highlight, kind of retracing our steps from the previous colour, only looking to make this edge a little bit finer, so finer lines. So the idea is some of that kind of bluish grey we used in the previous step is visible just beyond this, and what this will do is then give a sort of like from the pitch black, we then go into a bluish colour, and then grey on the very edges, and it'll give a very rich, ornate appearance to the black armour, so perfect for Black Templars. And remember, the real trick to doing the edge highlighting is to make sure you've got the paint prepared correctly on the palette, and you can just play around with it and test it, see how it feels. Still a little bit too dry there, so I'm just going to add a touch more water to it, just testing it to see how it feels on there. This is looking pretty good, so I'll just try a few lines. It seems pretty good to me, so I'm going to go along with that. And with this then, what we're looking to do is, again, that edge highlight all the way around, only now just be gentler with it. So for example, that line that we did initially on there, I'm going to retrace that, but this time just lightly skim along it with this colour, so very gently like that, so I get that lighter grey just appearing, just gradually building it up on the very edge. So there you can see what I mean. We've got that bright grey on the very edge, and we've got the slight bluishness just beyond it going into the black, which gives that really rich, deep black. So now it's just a matter of working your way around the miniature doing this, always looking for those sharp edges and just very, very gently skimming along. Remember, sometimes what you'll need to do is turn the model so that you're using the tip of the brush, and it's often easier to do it by just turning the model like this so that you're approaching painting in this downward motion. But again, just look for that edge and just focus the colour very gently just in the sharpest corner to get that nice highlight along. And there we are, I've finished applying that grey highlight, and you can see just what a difference it makes, helping all those details really pop out. And as I mentioned, it does take a bit of time doing that, but you can see the results are absolutely worth it. And if you want to, what you can then do is take it even further. So this might be, again, something you only reserve for your characters, maybe even just your army general. This is a third edge highlight to make some details just pop out a little bit more. Now, we're no longer going to be doing everything, we're just going to emphasize certain details. And so for this, what you now need is a light grey. So here I'm going to use some Administratum grey, still applied using that detail brush. And for this, what we need to do is set up the paint just like we did in that previous stage, just making sure it's nicely thinned down and just testing it on the palette to make sure it flows well. And then, of course, just make sure the brush is loaded correctly, so without loads and loads of paint on there. This looks pretty good. So with this, what we need to do now is take a look at the miniature for the parts that stand out the most and only apply it to those bits. So for example, if we look around his head, in this case, what we'll be looking at is the kind of edge that we've got on this little vent on top of the helmet. And it's just a light little skim across there to make it a little bit lighter. Same on the front of the faceplate. So this point right here is a definite place to do this on. So just a very small amount just there. Just bringing it up very lightly, very gently, just emphasizing the front of that, and then also going around the eye. So just a little bit just there. And also on the front of this collar, this really stands out here, so we want to get that as well. So you can see it's always just very gentle, almost little flicks of the brush, only ever using the side of it to get those areas, but you can see it just helps emphasize those parts a little bit more. And with that, the black of the power armour is now complete, and we can move on to highlighting those other remaining details on the miniature. And to do this, we're going to start out with that tabard, and here what we need is some screaming skulls, so a nice light bone colour to finish that off. And once that's done, we can then move on to highlighting all those leather belts, and here I'm going to use some scrag brown. Next up is going to be all the red details. Here I've got some Evilson Scarlet, and then finally what we need to do is highlight those joints in the armour, and for this I'm going to be using some Dawnstone once more. But first of all, what we need is some Screaming Skull, and to apply it I've switched to a small layer brush from Citadel for this. And what we're looking to do, remember when we were layering the fabric on the tabard earlier on, we kind of want to follow the same sort of motion of sweeping down the fabric, but this time we're just looking for the very tops of the creases of the fabric. So to help out with that, remember to prepare your paint, making sure it's nicely thinned down, so around about this kind of consistency here. Make sure you've got a fine tip on your brush, and then what we're looking for is the tops of those creases. So you can see a whole bunch of them around there. What we're looking to do is to do that sweeping motion going down the length of it, so it's just a matter of getting comfortable like this, find the top of them and just following them all the way down very gently using this motion. With that, the tabard's now fully highlighted, and so we can move on to those leather belts. And here what we need is some scrag brown, and using this we need to gently pick out the edges of them, and they stand out quite nicely, so here you can approach it like edge highlighting. Just remember to make sure you're comfortable so that your hands are nice and steady, so you can approach just using the side of the brush to catch that edge. Next up, we're ready to highlight all that red using some Evilson Scarlet, and here I'm still using that small layer brush, and for the weapons what we need to do is approach this just like we did when we were highlighting that armour earlier on. So an edge highlight looking for those sharp edges and gently skimming along each one of them, so along here for example as neatly as possible. Now when it comes to the Crusader seals on the other hand, these being more like fabric, we want to highlight a bit more like we did with the tabard. So look for any creases such as this one just here and just follow along the top of each one to get a highlight on those areas. And then finally we need to move on to Dawnstone, and with this all we need to do is pick out a few of these raised ridges on the joint. So for example along here, just very gently, just a few of them to help the texture stand out. With all those areas now highlighted, we can move on to highlighting the metallics as well. And here we're going to need two colours. First of all, some Corax bronze, and this is going to be for all of that brass. And then after that, we need to highlight all the silver. Now here I'm going to be using Mithril Blade, which is again one of the Tooth and Coats paints, but you need any bright silver here, any sort will do. So in this case, I recommend going for Stormhost Silver, for example, if you want to use Citadel. Whatever you choose though, first of all, what you're going to need is Corax bronze, and here I'm going to be applying it using that small layer brush once again. And this is going to be an edge highlight on all that brass detail. details. So as ever, just make sure you test the paint to get it nice and thin down so it's under control, and remember to make sure your brush isn't overloaded. And then it's just a matter of working around the miniature, looking for all those brass details and picking them out. So for example, on the chest just here, we've got this little shield design, so I'm going to apply this as an edge highlight going all the way around the outer edge of this detail. And also for these wings that we've got here, what you need to do is just make sure you don't have much paint in your brush. Just very carefully work your way across the top, just very, very gently, just working all the way down to get a highlight on that area there. Then when you get to the kind of feathers that are coming out from it, just have the brush fairly flat against the miniature and just skim along so that the bristles just pick out the very edge of those designs. And with that done, we can then move on to highlighting the silver detail, and for this I'm using Mithril Blade, but as I mentioned, any bright silver will do the job just nicely here, and like before, what we're looking for is the raised sharp edges, and we just need to gently pick them out with a small brush. Here I'm once again using my small layer brush from Citadel. And with that, all the metallics are highlighted too, and so now we can move on to the final details of the miniature. And for this, we're going to be looking at the eyes, but also we can add a little bit of script onto the Crusader seals. So for this, what we need first of all is a pure white. So for this, I'm going to use some matte white from the Army Painter. Then for the eyes, what we need to do is add a red glow onto it. And here what we need is a red wash or a contrast paint. I'm going to be using one of the contrast paints, so I've got Blood Angels Red for this. Once that's dry, we're then going to return to that pure white, so matte white once again, just to re-establish the effect that we're going to do on the eye. And then finally, we're just going to add a little bit of dirt at the very bottom of the tabard, and for this we need some Steel Legion drab. But first of all, we need that pure white, so I'm using some matte white here, and I've switched to my detail brush, that one I was using earlier for highlighting the black armour, because this is going to be some quite fine work, and the real key to it is, as ever, to make sure you thin your paint down correctly, to make sure it's under control, but also to make sure that it's not overloaded on your brush and not too runny. So kind of this sort of point here is good. And with this, for the eyes, what we want to do for this glow effect that we're going to make is to keep the model really steady in your hands and approach from the length of the eye, kind of down the side like this, and just paint a line very carefully along the middle of it. So we want to go just into that area there, just building it up to around about that point there like that. Now, in addition with this white, remember we can add some text onto the parchment here for these Crusader seals. And for these, all you got to do is just line it up so your brush is going to go across them like this. But rather than doing straight lines, just let your hand shake ever so slightly so you get some little random wiggles. This will create the impression of text along the paper. With that white established and completely dry on the eyes, what we can now do is add that red glow to them. And for this, I've just got a little bit of Blood Angels Red using that detail brush once again. And all you've got to do is just wash it into the entire recess of the eye so it stains all of it and looks brighter in the middle. Once the contrast paint is also completely dry, we can then return to matte white, and with this what we're looking to do is just re-establish the glow a little bit in the middle. So all we've got to do is approach just like we did with the base coat and just paint a slightly finer line right in the middle of the eye. And finally, as an optional extra detail, you can add a little bit of dust and dirt on the bottom of the tabard kicked up when the Marine was moving. And for this, just need some Steel Legion drab and a smaller dry brush. I've got one small one here from Citadel. What you do is just gently start stippling it towards the very bottom, just slowly building up that colour to get the hint of that brown starting to appear at the very bottom. Now, once done this, your miniature is ready to be based. And as ever, it's entirely up to you how you base it, but in this case, I'm going to go for a desert base. And here we have the completed Black Templar, ready to take his place in the Eternal Crusade in the name of the Emperor. So as you've seen, the most difficult part about painting Black Templars is highlighting that black power armour, because to get a clean finish on it is actually a little bit unforgiving. But don't worry, remember you can always neaten up any mistakes you happen to make, and it's just a matter of making sure that highlight is thinned down to the correct point to allow you to apply it correctly. Aside from that black power armour, as you've seen, everything else is very quick and very easy. So have fun painting your Black Templars, and we'll see you all again very soon.